The gray matter of the cerebrum, just the cerebrum, okay? Gray matter of the cerebrum is composed of unmyelinated cell bodies and axon terminals. So that means that this cell bodies and axon terminals, which means that we are looking at areas of synapse. We call clusters of cell bodies nuclei in the brain, and we tend to call them ganglia outside of the central nervous system. The unfortunate fact is that in olden days, everything was referred to as a ganglia. So old resources, outdated resources, will refer to these structures here as the basal ganglia. That's confusing, right? So we're going to consistently call these gray matter masses of cell bodies, axon terminals, and synapses, we're going to call these nuclei in the brain. Always begin with anatomy, right? Always begin with the location of the structure on the diagram before you dig into the function of the structure on the diagram. This is a coronal or a frontal section, dividing the brain into an anterior and a posterior section. These areas right here, the open areas, are the ventricles, the lateral ventricles. So looking at all of these basal nuclei here, it's important to understand that they have been revised in classification, especially in the last 20 years, as we advance our neurobiology, right? As our tools become more precise to study these areas, we realize that there are more discrete areas of the basal nuclei that we once thought were just one big area. I am concerned with you understanding or knowing where three structures are right now. This caudate nucleus is important for us to understand in purple here. And all of these structures that are in green can be collectively called the lentiform nucleus, which is an example of an outdated term, as I write it here for you to know it. And that's because over the past 20 years or so, we have come to understand that there are more discrete areas in what we thought was the lentiform nucleus. And we now have textbooks that aren't even using this term, but just looking at all of these four different areas. I suspect that very soon the globus pallidus will become an outdated term, and the external and internal segment of it will be given their own names. The basal nuclei are synapse areas between axon terminals and cell bodies. The neurotransmitters that are secreted at these synapses is dopamine, always, right? These basal nuclei, they run on dopamine. Dopamine can be either excitatory or inhibitory. It depends on which structure in the basal nuclei we're talking about. It depends on which two neurons are synapsing, but it's always dopamine. These areas of synapse, they will not work if the substantia nigra of the midbrain stops pumping out dopamine. Your basal nuclei are full of interneurons that are tasked with consolidating sensory information from ascending tracts in the cerebellum and determining a motor response that would then be distributed to the thalamus to descend the spinal cord. The basal nuclei, they rely primarily upon information from proprioceptors, joint perceptors, right, that are carefully placed at articulations like your elbows and hips and knees. And these proprioceptors determine your posture and position in space. The basal nuclei, they also receive information from your optic nerve and from other cranial nerves carrying sensory information regarding your balance and movement. So when the basal nuclei receives all of this sensory information from the cerebellum and from your cranial nerves and from the spinal cord, it's primarily concerned with preventing unnecessary movements. So the basal nuclei want you to raise your hand, and it will help you do that, but it will prevent you from over-raising your hand, from stopping it when it's completely parallel when you're with your body. Okay, so for example, an unnecessary movement could also be a tremor. And because this info is funneled through the thalamus, a Parkinson's tremor can be voluntarily stopped, right? The thalamus is all about conscious information. So a Parkinson's patient is able to prevent the tremor, but only consciously, not unconsciously. Right? The basal nuclei that they have, they're not getting the dopamine they need from the substantia nigra. And so a Parkinson's patient's basal nuclei don't only take the information from the cerebellum or your ascending tracts, it also retrieves learned movement patterns from your memory. So like a sequence of dance steps, the steps needed to tie your shoes, any patterns involved in playing an instrument, knitting, anything like that. All of these pattern movements are accessed by the basal nuclei before it distributes those instructions to the thalamus. In your cerebrum, there's an outward radiating web of unmyelinated neurons. This has previously been called the corona radiata, and that term, it just means head, and radiata meaning radiating outward. These arrows on this diagram indicate those neurons. Over the last 20 years, though, we've come to know more about their function, and we've replaced their name with this name reticular formation, and it can sometimes be called the reticular activating system. All of these neurons work together with some of your special senses, sensory information, and motor output pathways to give you it's like a baseline of consciousness. So there are differences in reticular activating systems, and they account for how people can study differently. And what I mean is, I need to be in a separate sensory deprivation tank in order to study, and I have a best friend who could study in the cafeteria. Neither one of us is good or bad in terms of our consciousness. It's just how our reticular activating system is capable of ignoring certain stimuli or being distracted by it. Pain modulation, or your conscious interpretation of pain, is funneled through this reticular activating system. So when you live in chronic pain, each time you experience pain, you level up. This is how it works. You experience pain. You convince your brain that the pain you experience is a normal level. You experience pain again at an increased level. You convince your brain that this new level is normal. You experience pain again at an even more increased level because you've been ignoring the fact that you're in pain and doing more damage to whatever it is. But you convince your brain that the new level of pain is normal. And it's this cycle that just increases your tolerance for pain and allows you to ignore your body yelling at you that there is something wrong. And personally, this invalidates my inability to sleep as a product of pain levels, which is common among people. The reticular formation of the cerebrum is what we're talking about. And it's just gray matter that's innervating the big brain hat and keeping you awake. A lot of the fibers of this gray matter are connected to area in the pons and areas in the medulla oblongata of the brainstem. And the reticular formation, it works with these areas to control your motor output to neuromuscular junctions, but it also helps control your output to your cardiovascular organs, your heart, your blood vessels, and your lungs, regulating your breathing rate and your intake of oxygen, and thus your production of ATP.